The 2025 Namibia International Energy Conference was held in Windhoek, Namibia, under the theme Leading the Way, Becoming an Energy Hub with In-Country Value. The event gathered government officials, industry leaders, investors, and members of the business community to explore opportunities for industry growth and highlight their strategic milestones, positioning Namibia as a leading energy hub.
As we continue to build Namibia's energy story together, let us remember it takes a village. And I would just like to thank you for once again, coming from far and wide to be a part of this conversation. And I wish you fruitful deliberations. And may God bless the conference. Thank you very much.
There are moments in a nation's history when vision, leadership, and opportunity converge to unlock new possibilities.
This is not just about the extraction of hydrocarbons. It's about creating long-term value for our people, building skills, infrastructure, and inclusive economic growth.
We at the African Energy Chamber believe strong and square on what Namibia's promise can be, should be, and will be.
This year's theme, Leading the Way, Becoming an Energy Hub with an In-Country Value, reflects our national resolve to shape our future with purpose and clarity. It is now my honor to declare the 7th edition of the Namibian International Energy Conference officially open. I thank you, unquote.
Namibia's energy sector presents significant opportunities for capital investment, driven by the country's abundant renewable energy resources, growing electricity demand, and strategic push for energy independence. This panel discussion explores how Namibia aims to reduce reliance on energy imports and expand access to reliable power, and the role of supportive policies, including public-private partnerships and other investment incentives to achieve this.
Ladies and gentlemen, how are we feeling? Of course, we've gone through some of the highlights of day one. We've had a phenomenal start to the morning so far with several sessions that have taken place here in the Dome. Coupled with that, we've also had an opportunity to participate in several of the power talks that have also taken place at the exhibition center, again, largely focused on local content and how we fully drive the active participation of Namibians within unlocking Namibia as a hub for energy. But as you might recall, just from this morning, we spoke about the opportunities that exist for Namibia to be as competitive as many of its other peers across the globe. We've spoken highly around the opportunities that continue to exist by leveraging off of technology and innovation within the gas and oil space. How it is that IOCs themselves continue to position themselves for growth that looks to be enhanced, and this is underscored by the efforts and commitment that was made by key leaders within national oil companies as well as the government that provided us with some clarity and policy certainty just yesterday. So we understand the policies in place, we fully understand that the commitment has been made by both the public and the private sector, but to unlock all of this, we need money. And that's where our next conversation heads us to. Unlocking capital to ensure that we fully drive the necessary growth within Namibia's energy sector. What models need to be implemented, what opportunities need to be sought, potential partnerships that also need to be engaged upon, but also getting clarity on the current status quo. What is it that key financial leaders and institutions are already doing in the country to make sure that we unpack the potential that needs to continue to be explored? So on that note, we're going to participate in a 45-minute panel discussion. We do welcome you all as key audience members. If you do have any questions, there will be an opportunity for you to address them going forward. I'm going to welcome my 4 panelists who are going to join me on stage, each of whom represent key financial institutions that serve the market here in Namibia, representing both commercial banks, those with an area of play within project development, as well as, of course, when it comes to private equity to a certain extent, also unlocking opportunities for those with a specific focus on renewable energy, and of course, development finance institutions. These are some of the participants who will be sharing their views and perspective with us today. So, allow me to welcome them, ladies and gentlemen, to provide us with some perspective. I'll introduce all of them. They'll make their way up on stage. And then maybe we chase the sleep away and give them a wonderful round of applause to make sure that they feel warmly welcome ahead of this panel. So, allow me to welcome to the front of the stage, ladies and gentlemen, the Chief Operating Officer of Africa 50, Tshepidi Moremong. She'll be followed by Heike Scholz, who's the Chief Strategy and Business Development Officer at the Development Bank of Namibia. Benedict Libanda, Chief Executive Officer of the Environmental Investment Fund. And lastly, followed by Sepho Haihambo, C-suite executive and African Financial Services thought leader, who also joins us on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, some of you know the phrase, "Magisfo wagistu." None of that is going to happen after this conversation. So, on that note, can we please give my panelists a warm round of applause as they make their way up on stage? It can be a little louder than that. Fantastic. Thank you so much for the warm welcome to our panelists, and most importantly, our panelists for also giving us their time and who will be sharing their industry expertise with us on the stage. Now, as has been highlighted, these are different organizations that are present, but one thing that capital always needs, it's been mentioned earlier in previous conversations by both IOC and NOCs, but also one key aspect that we're also well aware of as individuals who themselves actively participate in transactions is capital needs certainty. That certainty is underscored by policy. And perhaps that's a good place for us to start, just to understand the level of certainty that we've been able to create, find, and to partner on when it comes to Namibia as a key market for enhanced capital investment. And perhaps, Heike, I can start off with you here. Bearing in mind that you do represent a development finance institution, but that so far has been very critical in the role of capital within the energy space. Policy certainty, is it something that you have that you're content with?
I think, sorry, it's a problem of picking up the mic for the first time, but policy uncertainty is really one of the key things that our investors need. It's also something that we as financiers need, because if you don't know what to expect from tomorrow, you don't know what to fund against. Unfortunately, you'll always find when you've got a room full of bankers or a room full of other investors, always complain there's not enough certainty. And when you've got a room full of government officials, they say, but we've got all the certainty you need. We'll be here forever, but things change. And I think the important thing to realize in this debate as well is that laws can also change. Even in some cases, the constitution can change, and we need to be mindful to constantly, even in an environment where you've got specific acts that investors are happy with, are there, that there are potential changes and that we find ways together to manage those. And this is where I always believe it's so important to have the in-country development financiers in your funding mix, because they help bringing in the national kind of voice as well, and to be wise with the partners you have in your projects.
100%. I'm glad that you allude to that, having the necessary partners locally to ensure that you unlock that opportunity. And maybe I can throw this to you as well, Sepho, just to give us some perspective as a thought leader within the space that you're in, and obviously leveraging off of the experience you've had as a commercial banker. Perhaps there are these sentiments that you echo in terms of the certainty, but most importantly, the partnership with the local environment to co-craft and perhaps co-engage in terms of the funding models that can be put in place based on the back of policy.
So the policy is an important question, and I think in the energy space you'll find that there's lots, that while there's policies that are designed in isolation, there's also policies that impact by association. So for example, the Namibia Investments Act or Bill that has been in discussion for an extended period of time. So in making investments in the energy field, even if it's not directly related to, it does impact that as a consideration. But to talk to your specific question around funding models, I think it really depends on a few key aspects. I mean, funding happens on various spectrums. I mean, I think one, there's the term funding for capital expenditure, and then in the shorter term on the working capital space. So depending where a project is or what the project sponsors are looking to achieve, then financial institutions can partner with them for that purpose. So in Namibia, this industry, we're sitting here now at the 7th conference. We have had local players that have had licenses for a long period of time, and they've gone through processes of getting farming agreements, to get equity partners to help them with the development of these blocks, to get them to a point where there's more of a certain return for debt funders,
Yes.
because essentially we need the money back.
Yes.
And capital doesn't have a moral compass or moral affinity. It will flow to where it will get its return and where it will be repaid. So project finance models have obviously worked quite well, and in the exploration stage, asset-backed finance also works particularly well where there's a strong balance sheet.
100%. And we do see that it's evidenced by the partnerships that I guess have been formed by many of the IOCs together with institutions like commercial banks that have been present, and we have continued to have a presence here in Namibia. I do want us to shift gears and of course perhaps focus and follow through on the journey that we're on. Yesterday in one of the earlier panels, one thing was clear, is that production is what we need. We've participated in the exploration activity. We still need more, but production is essentially what we're looking to scale up on and drive towards in order to attain first oil. And maybe this is where I can come to both yourself, Benedict, and Sepidi, as the project financiers. Number one, just to shed some light on how it is that we need to gear ourselves up, number one, for ongoing investment within exploration activities, largely within the oil and gas space, or rather energy at large. And of course, Benedict, I understand that from yours, that focuses largely on renewable energy. But from there, lessons and learnings that we need to leverage to ensure that we build up on improving production. Sepidi, maybe let's start off with you.
Sure, thank you. I guess before I get started and answer your question, I think several of the entities here are known to the audience, but if you can just indulge me for 2 seconds and sort of explain who Africa 50 is. We're an infrastructure investor focused primarily on project preparation and late-stage equity financing. We're owned by 32 African governments and 5 institutional investors. And really our remit is Pan-African, to see how we work with our shareholders in the private sector in accelerating implementation of infrastructure on the continent. And I'm going to turn this a little bit more to, I know everybody's focused a lot on oil and gas, but I think, as you said earlier, really how does one look at this, just from making sure that you get from concept to execution or implementation of a project. The key thing for any project, right, even to get from exploration to exploitation, is one needs to focus on the preparation.
Yes.
Right? And that's where we fall short on the continent. Approximately 80% of infrastructure projects fail on the continent because they don't have the requisite feasibility studies undertaken.
Got you.
And critical to that is really understanding, one, as was said earlier, the environment. What we've seen working is really sort of a PPP framework, right? Where there's a proper allocation of risk between the private sector and the public sector, where there's a proper risk mitigation strategy that is in place in order to be able to execute that. But primarily what we've seen missing in many of our projects is that early stage risk capital. Too often when people talk about financing, they're thinking about debt, but how is it that you can unlock that early stage risk capital to be able to put together that business plan in place, to be able to structure a project, get the technical studies done, get the requisite modeling done and the structuring, and then you can bring in the debt funders to do the actual implementation or the construction of that asset.
100%. Maybe you can indulge us a little further on the theme of project preparation, especially given where we are right now within the energy space in Namibia. And what themes need to form part of those conversations between stakeholders like yourselves and those who are in the room to ensure that as we shift we are taking a look at the correct dynamics in terms of not only just risk, but also understanding the goal and the objective here, given that there's a prioritization on local content, of course prioritizing active participation and growth for the IOCs, but of course a sense of sustainability to the projects in the long term.
So I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, right? So Heike, I think, spoke earlier around the regulatory framework is important.
Yeah.
But one needs to also be flexible as to if there are changes that are going to take place within your local environment. But as you rightly said, certainty to a certain degree is critical, right? These are long-term contracts that are going into play. So how does one deal with changes in the regulatory framework? How does one think about FX? How does one think about inflation, right? So the question though is, how do you mitigate these risks, and who's best placed to mitigate these risks?
Yeah.
And are there other instruments that you can use to bring to play in order for you to be able to mitigate these risks? But sometimes it boils down to licensing, right? Just getting that ESAI conducted and being able to engage with the local authorities to be able to drive that and be able to assist you with getting it fast-tracked.
Yeah.
That also comes into play in delays in infrastructure projects getting off the ground.
100%. That's a theme that I do want us to come back to in just a moment, especially just expanding further on the risk environment, especially from a macroeconomic point of view, because we're well aware of the risks that do exist globally and the environment that we're currently in. But Benedict, if you could perhaps just leverage off of the feedback that we've heard so far from Tshepiedi, specifically regarding project preparation. I know that this is your area of interest, largely within the renewable energy space, and it would be refreshing just to hear if there are some insights you can share there that are key learnings. Macroeconomic themes as well that need to be considered. Feel free to share perspective there too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. What really good time to live. The only man standing tall on the panel, surrounded by beautiful women. I see my senior from Vinduk, Lucas, looking at me enviously.
No pressure. We're just following the mandate that the Prime Minister said yesterday.
Okay, great stuff. Let me put this in context. As Namibia continues to investigate sustainable pathways for investment, there is a stark reality that the government is faced with fiscal constraints. So public funds alone are not adequate enough to propel investment, especially towards strategic sectors such as energy, specifically to the renewable energy sector in the country. And the government took a bold decision and developed a policy that is called the Integrated National Finance Framework. In short, the INFF, not EFF, INFF, yeah. So that policy...
For those of us who might not be familiar with that acronym, can you please explain what it is for the benefit of everyone?
Yes, that policy provides a roadmap on how to blend in public sector capital and crowd in private sector capital for large-scale investment. So through that policy, it also targets how you de-risk projects, get private sector participation, create platforms for investors' ecosystems in different levels. To place it in practice, we develop a fund called the SDG Namibia 1 Fund. And that fund has got 3 sub-funds. One is a development fund, which is capitalized at $100 million, mainly concessional funding. And that is more for early stage development, de-risking projects for the private sector. It's a risk fund facility. If a project does not get to FID, for example, and has been funded through that fund, we write off the investments. To date, we have made 3 investment decisions to a value of $1 billion Namibian, mainly at early stage, trying to de-risk these assets for private sector investments. Then we've got a second fund called the Construction Equity Fund within the SDG Namibia 1. And that is a commercial tranche fund where we are targeting institutional investors, pension funds, and other commercial banks to come in and participate. And in that fund, we're targeting a 1 billion euro investment, let me say US dollars investment. At the moment, we're at the market trying to get investors ecosystems in that space. And we have received good term sheets that we're busy looking at the moment. And we hope that by the end of this year, we'll close that fund. The third
so we're
fund,
making progress,
yes.
Okay, on the second fund. Third fund?
The third fund will be the operational fund, yeah. So that will come at a later stage, targeting mainly fixed income investors, those with a low risk appetite, who would like return on their investment right away, such as pension funds and commercial. And that will come 3-4 years later when the assets have been de-risked from development, from construction, and now operationalized. So those are kind of the structures, blended structures that we've created using these INFF policies and guidelines, enabling private sector to come on a platform, enabling philanthropic organization, development donors and equity firms to come on a platform and give them an opportunities to participate.
Got you. Sipho, you wanted to share some feedback. We'll come back to those funds in just a moment to see how they've been progressing, but go ahead.
So I just wanted to expand on the project preparation and the importance of that, to Sipidi's point. Is a key consideration around that preparation across the value chain, because a lot of the times the projects are prepared almost in isolation. You'll think back to, in the Namibian context, we've had Kudu gas that was discovered many years ago, but while the asset in itself was viable, there was different preparations that probably needed to be considered across that value chain in terms of the infrastructure development, etc., as opposed to just the development of the asset in itself.
Yes.
So in those conversations, it is important that the value chain is then prepared to be able to have each financing leg of the project realize its full potential in return on investment.
Got you. I think that's important, because what we are getting out of the conversation so far is an understanding that we have made progress in terms of policy. The structures are there. There are even establishments and documents that share details on funds that need to be established to ensure that we understand how not only the government can provide capital, but of course how this capital does need to be allocated, which is a factor that we'll get into in a moment. Coupled with that, there's active participation right across the spectrum, whether it's from development finance institutions or those who actually work on project financing, commercial banks, and of course institutions with a very deliberate and intentional view. So one thing we know for sure, there's money. Is it safe to say that? And the confidence and the certainty is there to ensure that we're able to allocate this capital. But what's coming up is how we actively plan for that going forward. And maybe this is a good place for us to start as we start drafting and crafting ideas of how best it is that we enhance the collaborative efforts to unlock funding, and most importantly, ensure that capital can be allocated. PPPs, we hear about all the time. And perhaps this is a good point for us to touch on them, as we're well aware from a macroeconomic point of view. It was shared by Mr. Mathie, who joined us yesterday from S&P Global, highlighting the macroeconomic concerns we need to be mindful of from S&P. And he had largely alluded to the fact that we're well aware that globally, inflation, interest rates, the concerns around the global economic environment do weigh heavily on the decisions we make. So this means we all need to club together to make sure that we find those solutions. I'm keen for us to talk about the theory of how we do need to rethink PPPs, financing within Namibia's energy space, and then from there perhaps move into some practical examples that your institutions have already actively participated in. Benedict, perhaps I'll start with you just to give us your perspective there, because you have alluded to the policy and partnerships that are in place. Seppo, I'm more than happy for you to also share your feedback, because this is a space that you've also participated in, but it's open to the panel. Benedict?
Thanks once again. Yes, I spoke about the SDG number 1 fund that we established, and to run a fund, you need fund managers. So to create that fund managers, the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia partnered with a European-based fund manager, that is the climate fund managers, through these PPP arrangements. And we created a fund manager called the Namibia Hydrogen Fund Managers, where the government, represented by EIF, controls 49% equity stake in that fund, and then the climate fund managers from Netherlands control 51% of the fund. And this works extremely well because it comes with different strengths. We are utilizing international experts and skills really to build a local fund, and at sometimes you are cross-pollinating skills, you're capacitating the local local entities to participate in complex infrastructure investment projects and to structure such projects. And from where we stand is that partnership is really key to unlocking large-scale capital for sustainable investments. I'm trying to use my words very careful, not to say green investment or climate investment, but sustainable investment.
Got you. I'm going to ask you as well, if you can just elaborate, as we've heard, local content remains a permanent theme and a prevalent theme throughout the course of the conference here to make sure that ultimately Namibians do benefit from the opportunities that exist in energy. Sustainable and sustainable, I guess, for those in the oil space. But I'm keen to get your perspective as to how you've actively ensured that local communities, local content is incorporated in these funding models as well, perhaps through, I guess, community funds that might have been established to ensure that they benefit too.
Okay, yes, we are very strong on ESG. One of the elements where we capitalize and take opportunities to integrate local content, because the E is for environment and the S for social and G for governance. But that social component, how can we really capitalize on it? How can Namibians participate? How can we improve the well-being of Namibians? And it's only by inclusive participation. Have them included, whether it's procurement, job, opportunities for safe
Have you
deliveries.
done this through your organization?
Yes, we've done that. To give you a practical example, one of our green hydrogen project, it has got a capital investment estimate of $11 billion US. And 30% of that is reserved for the local content. So that includes procurement of different services, and that is contained in the feasibility and implementation agreement. So it's a legal requirement of such particular projects to observe and commit to that local content.
Got you. Fantastic. We like the practical examples because it means that there could be lessons and learnings there that we could also continue to implement into other structures as well as opportunities that exist. Sipho, your thoughts on the PPP structures, how to think of them innovatively, especially given the current environment that we're in the energy space?
Okay, so recently we announced a partnership with Moneda Investments and committed an amount of funding towards working capital solutions. The partnership looks at a structure where they would provide equity and the bank then plays the role of providing debt finance. This is on a working capital basis. And the reason this works particularly well is because they have great experience in terms of working with small businesses to be able to execute on a contract and minimize performance risk, which in a Namibian context where local service providers are relatively new in providing services to oil and gas, it becomes a key concern from a banking perspective that you don't want to be taking performance risk. So a contract like this or a partnership like this where you've got a partner that provides equity into a specific contract that supports the local player to be able to execute on that contract gives comfort to a financial institution that's lending that there's a high probability of repayment. But having said that, going forward, I do think that there's wider considerations that we need to take from a policy perspective because...
Can you share an example there? What about policy there needs to shift?
Well, the thing is, we're going to be building certain industries from scratch. There's 10 years going forward, there's going to be service providers or services that previously weren't in Namibia. And as a small country, achieving economies of scale in those new supporting industries is going to take time.
Yes.
So the possibly is space for conversations around what government subsidies would be available to those businesses that have shown potential to be big players in that space. I mean, if you think back into, like in the US, I think for over 35 years, there was subsidies that were given in the wind generation industry. So I do think there's an opportunity to think creatively and brainstorm how do we ensure that we achieve economies of scale and achieve those economies of scale quickly.
100%. This is where you get us excited here, because it does speak to another an aspect of local content that we need to be mindful of, and how it does speak to policy, how it then speaks to people, and the funding models behind this. Heike, I'm hoping this is where you're getting excited, because part of your portfolio as well through the Development Bank of Namibia is not only capital that is allocated to projects in the energy space, but also on SMMEs. And maybe you can also just share your perspective on some of the suggestions, partnerships that do need to be explored, not only to enhance PPP funding within the energy space, but PPP funding within the energy space for SMMEs and entrepreneurs. As Seppo has already mentioned, there's a whole sector and new opportunity that we're looking to grow and establish here.
It looks like you've read my mind.
Oh.
Which is really a nice space to be in, because I wanted to add to what Seppo has been saying about the partnerships. Yes, we've got government as a partner, we've got big industry or players in the energy space. But on the other side, we've got the local content, the man on the street, the woman on the street that also needs to make a living. And especially with the higher unemployment numbers in Namibia, we need to create an environment where we can allow more and more people to enter into business themselves. And this is something where the Development Bank of Namibia has been very active, not only through our SME portfolio, where we support businesses and have pioneered something we called contract-based finance. In the past, what we funded there were essentially government construction projects, and we provide a loan to emerging entrepreneurs on the back of these contracts. This is a very easy model to replicate, for example, in the oil and gas space, where you've got contractors and also the majors having long payment circles and finding or long payment cycles, and finding a way just to cushion the cash flow impact for your SMEs. But it doesn't stop with finance. We also do have skills gaps. And this is where the Development Bank of Namibia, in conjunction with our government, developed a national mentoring and coaching facility that's open to all the other financiers in the room to send the MSMEs that they fund to this program, to have someone walking alongside them, working through regulations, taxes, basic accounting and basic business management. And lastly, in that whole environment, with Namibia's history, very often a lot of our emerging entrepreneurs don't have collateral or own contributions that bankers require, and rightly so. So there's also a credit guarantee scheme that DBN pioneered together with a number of partners. And this shows you again, public-private partnerships beyond the legal framework that can also work just by us taking hands. We've got most of the commercial banks tapping into the system. And while we've developed it, the credit guarantee scheme sits with government's national risks, special risk insurer, Nasria. So you've got all kinds of players taking hands to help establish an industry that can provide employment to individuals, but that also can ready themselves to the boom we expect to see in the oil and gas sector.
100%. Very valid points that you mentioned, and I think really critical that we do start. No worries, we'll get that mic for you. Ensuring that we do continue to unpack these innovative solutions that do need to be implemented, right? To ensure that everybody literally is along for the journey. As we know, big business has its commitment. We certainly need to make sure that we prioritize investment and a focus as well on participants within the local content segment, and finding new innovative structures and models that can come there. In a moment, we will come to you as an audience for questions. So if you have been catching a nap, this is where you wake up. and the microphone will come to you. But what you've just mentioned, Heike, I think gets me excited because this is also perhaps where, Tepidi, you can give us some perspective. I'm aware that at Africa 50, you're not a venture capital fund, as you've mentioned, focused on project financing, but you've been in the finance space for a while. You've seen and witnessed some shifts and changes. Almost sounds like there's a greater opportunity here as well for more venture capital funds to come on board and even private equity for us to ensure that we're able to unlock more capital within the, I guess, downstream opportunities that might exist when it comes to the energy space. Your thoughts on this?
I think from a funding perspective or even sources of financing, it's beyond just private equity, right? I think as a continent, one, we've seen the retreat of global capital. So competition for very limited sources of capital is very prominent and something that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing the fiscal constraints that our governments are facing. So those days of governments being able to fund their projects is no longer reality. And so it's really about tapping into different sources. Benedict talked about it earlier. How do you bring in blended finance models into the picture? So bringing together commercial capital with philanthropic capital, right? How do you bring in philanthropic capital as potentially the first loss for technologies that have been tested in markets that are slightly more risky, such that you can attract the commercial capital? And I think this is where, you know, PPPs, for many of us, make a lot of sense, because that's the way you can bring in private sector financing. Private sector is motivated, one, to make sure that they can execute much faster than we've seen governments being able to do it. And to me, this is not just theory. As an as an institution that has been doing this for many years, we've literally just finished commissioning a 420 megawatt hydropower plant in Cameroon. It's taken 5 years from concept to execution, even during COVID. The motivation, we need to make sure that it's operationalized fast. We need to make sure that we are getting funding such that we can get the revenues in order for us to be able to pay down debt. So that to me is a real great confluence of private sector. So we're working together with EDF, development finance institutions, commercial banks, and with the government as an off-taker. Critical to that is obviously ensuring that the off-taker is credit-worthy and making sure that there could be some credit enhancements around that, be able to support it. We've done something similar in 400 megawatts of power that we've done in Egypt. But the beauty about the Egypt story is that Benban, which is the 4th largest solar PV plant on the continent globally, the beauty about that, there's a feed-in tariff structure, right? So as we came in, we knew what the tariff was. We knew how to work within that tariff. And what we then do is look at technology. So using bifacial solar PV panels to make sure that we can actually enhance solar generation. So what you're seeing is not just the capital, but you're bringing in capital that also looks to see how we enhance and optimize it through technology and bringing in the latest technology.
100%. Valid points that have been mentioned. Thought you might have some feedback that you want to give us, Seppo. Go ahead.
Not feedback, but something that is also a consideration, because a lot of the times in an African context, the off-takers will then be paying in local currency, and the technology investment is a hard currency investment. So just the consideration around the market structuring solutions that need to be brought into that. In a Namibian context where we use a currency that's pegged to the rand, we are fortunate that we can use currency swaps to kind of even out that currency risk. But in other countries that don't have globally traded currencies, it's probably a more difficult exercise, and I'd be keen to learn from Sepidi how that works in for example, in Cameroon. But I mean, just again to the earlier point, that you know, the project sponsors often have a view that, you know, that they look at their project in isolation and they say, my project works, therefore, you know, why can't I get funding? But the considerations from a financial institution are so much wider, because one, as I said earlier, you look at the value chain, you look at the currency exposures, etc. But it's not that it can't be addressed, it's just, it's a longer conversation.
valid point that you're raising and one to be considered. We've got feedback from your panelists here as well. So perhaps, Tevile, you want to share feedback? And Heinke, you've been noted.
I think Tsepo brings up a very good point. I think too often we've turned globally for funding, and I think the pension fund industry, asset management industry, institutional investor industry on the continent needs to come to the party.
Yeah.
Right? So really good to see what South Africa has done with Reg 28, and I think something similar here in Namibia, where you're saying there's an allocation now to infrastructure investing, there's an allocation now to the alternative sector. Because too often what we're seeing on the continent is institutional investors are still investing in T-bills, right? They're still investing in real estate. We need to invest in real assets. And we cannot expect global investors to come into our markets if local institutional investors are not leading.
100%.
And so for us as an institution, that's really what we've been trying to drive is how do we get local domestic capital mobilization, one, dealing with the whole currency mismatch, how is it that we can bring in more local currency financing into projects, but importantly, looking to make sure that local capital is driving local investment.
100%. Hoping that there might be some asset managers in the house, but if they aren't, that's fine. It's a conversation that we'll definitely have and direct with them when we do interact with them. Heinke, you had some feedback as well on the points raised.
Yes, and besides the working together of various financiers, which is absolutely critical to have the right kind of transaction together, we also need to be mindful about regional implications. If we look at Namibia, for example, we started with supplying renewable energy into Namibia's grid itself. Now some of the players can export to the Southern African power pool, but there you've got more foreign exchange limitations. We need to do a lot of work in terms of regional integration and as Africans to start pulling together, both at regional SADC level and then at a wider level to really lean into the multinational organizations that operate across our countries and to combine that with local funding solutions to provide the optimal innovative solution for our clients.
100%. Very critical points that are being raised here, and I think many thoughts that allow us to walk away with in terms of understanding the solutions that need to be brought on board as we journey towards making sure that not only do we get to an environment where we see increased and enhanced production and productivity within the energy space, but that there's active participation of all role players within that regard. Full understanding of the risks that are involved, making sure that we do unlock local capital, because primarily we will be able to see the tangible results of that in terms of the investment that needs to take place and collaboration within the different regions, which many IOCs already operate in. So perhaps that's also an avenue that we do need to be looking at. What I think has been really critical for us to understand here is that the capital is there. Capital is there and we're looking to unlock more capital. The interest, the certainty, the guidance between all participants and stakeholders, clarity has been provided. There are some aspects of policy that can shift as the landscape does continue to grow and develop, and we need to be mindful of the ecosystems that we are creating to allow all stakeholder groups, big business as well as those who will participate in local content, need to be brought along for the journey. There's clear allocation of capital right across the spectrum for all types of energy. As we're well aware, Namibia is looking to diversify or has a diversified economy, but is also looking to diversify its energy base. What I believe is critical that has also to be mentioned here today is an understanding of how we shift the needle going forward. We're well aware that, Benedict, you've mentioned ESG. Yesterday in the closing panel with the key leaders in the ESG space, it was mentioned that perhaps the S and the G should be the primary focus, then moving on to the E. But despite that being said, what I want us to reflect on is how we shift the needle to ensure that in 5, 10, even 15 years' time, as we're well aware that these projects take time, that we've seen a shift in the allocation of capital, the structure of this capital, but most importantly, sustainable investment too, which does speak to ensuring that we meet the various goals that we have. Given that you represent different institutions, I'm keen for you just to share your closing remarks, essentially what success looks like and on a sustainable basis, given the areas that you're from. Let's start with yourself, Benedict. We'll make our way down the panel with brief closing remarks from each of you within a minute each.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we all understand that risk management and capital structuring evolves over time, and that we've, I think, reached the point where innovation should claim its place in the whole structuring, spectrum. At ERF, for example, what we're trying to do right now, we are busy investigating new and additional way of structuring and raising capital at scale. And two of the modalities that we've put in place that we're investing is on the carbon market. Of course, talking to renewable investments in the energy sector. The carbon market presents huge opportunity in terms of trading carbon credits for our country. We are net carbon sink. Even with petroleum drilling, we will still be a net carbon sink in Namibia. So there's a lot of opportunities in that space. Secondly, we're looking at debt for nature swap. So how do we swap our 61% debt to GDP ratio and use the premium to invest in sustainable renewable infrastructures, for example. And those comes at really a difficult time where we need to crowd in all these sorts of capital. But it requires, again, very bold decisions, entities to be to have a high risk appetite to participate in those, infants, structuring, test, learn, and master at a later stage. And, at the ERF, we've got a high appetite for risk. So we get involved in those kind of transactions, and that's what we'll be doing in the next 2 years or so.
100%. To stay with you for just 1 second, that second fund that you had mentioned in terms of the targets, euro-based, do we have clarity on when we might be able to reach those targets yet? The IFF targets that you had mentioned in terms of the various funds. I'm trying to leave it on an optimistic note here for us to have some good news to look forward to before the end of the year.
Well, the good news is, sorry, I missed the last part.
The good news that we're looking forward to, you mentioned the funds earlier, the 3 different types of funds where government is ensuring that we're raising and unlocking capital. The second one you mentioned specifically, you mentioned that we hadn't reached our targets just yet using the euro or euro-based funding. I'm keen to understand if we'll have any clarity on those outcomes before the end of the year.
Okay, that would be in the construction equity fund. Yes. I think that's a very important and strategic designed fund, and it provides even small entities, financial intermediaries to participate because it pulls, it's a vehicle to pull capital from different sorts of entities. We're talking about large-scale investments here.
Yes.
So, and for you to participate, you need really deep pocket. So, but most of the...
I asked that deliberately because you know who's in the room, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, and now we're talking, projects, large scales in Namibian context, of course. Yeah.
Got you.
Yeah, so we're talking about, around 40 billion Namibian dollars per project, etc. And this sort of projects, local domestic markets don't have such funding if they have to participate on an individual basis.
Gotcha.
But if you provide a platform, a pooled platform where different, even small equity firms to participate, who can able to, raise capital domestically, that can really make a meaningful impact, on the local market. Yeah.
100%. Sipho, maybe we can get your feedback and perspective. What needs to shift? What do we need to implement? And how do we guarantee success on a sustainable basis?
Sure, guarantee success is a tall ask.
I know that's a difficult one when it comes to capital.
But to what success looks like, well, first oil production would be definitely a sign of success. I think a burgeoning, well, not a well-established value chain around the energy sector operating in Namibia definitely would be a key indicator of success, with investments being made in the logistics, expansions of ports, rail, hospitality, and other infrastructure required to ensure that across the value chain it's well catered for. with sustainable energy security for the country, addressing a key social aspect in terms of rural electrification, making energy more widely available. I think key is the triple Ps and how we identify what existing gaps there are and closing out those gaps and reimagining what is possible to achieve that intended state of future success. Like start with the end in mind.
Yes.
And work backwards.
100%. Let's get your closing remarks, Sabili. What does success look like? How do we get there? And how do we make it sustainable?
Let me start off with what I think the key ingredients are to success. I think political will, a clear roadmap by government as to what it is that they want to achieve, such that investors are clear as to these are the needs of the country. And I think I'd like to hone in a little bit on what Seppo was talking about around ecosystems, because we do focus quite a bit on just an individual project. One of the things that always astounds me, especially country Namibia, my own country, Botswana, we've got one of the highest irradiation rates on the continent. Why is it that neither of us still have a significant solar park such that we're net exporters of power? Why is it we haven't created an ecosystem around something that we have a clear comparative advantage over than other countries within the region? So it really taps into what Seppo is saying is, let's think about this holistically.
Yes.
How is it that as a country, we are focused really on broad diversification of our economy, and that looks at, if I was to take a renewable energy example, solar park, making sure that we've got training centers, establishing ourselves as a center of excellence for something within renewable energy. That is what success would look like. Production of battery energy storage also within that ecosystem.
100%. Fantastic. Heike, we'll close it off with you. What does success look like? How do we get there? How do we make it sustainable?
I'll start with ultimate success. Jobs, jobs, jobs.
Yes.
We need them so desperately in Namibia. But this is an end outcome, and there are many milestones along the way, and my fellow panelists touched on some of the issues that are extremely close to my heart. We need to collaboratively work together to find innovative solutions that work for us, and not only for us as Namibia as a country, but for the wider region, that we can really create the success stories we need for Africa, made in Africa. We are creative. We need to tap into the innovation that is part of us and find the solutions. And very often you'll be surprised. It's tiny little tweaks that are needed. The tiny little tweaks that the Development Bank of Namibia had to make to fund the first renewable energy plant in Namibia. There were minor issues people didn't get their minds around. Since then, the whole industry has moved. We've not only funded solar, we've funded wind, we've funded transactions that don't only sell to government off-takers like NamPower, but we've funded transactions that have got mines as off-takers and create a whole ecosystem around that. And now we're moving towards funding transactions that export into the Southern African power pool. So very often, it's simple incremental solutions that are needed to unlock an entire ecosystem and to give Namibia the jobs we so desperately need.
Definitely. Taking it back to basics, right? Because true success is when we have success all around within the ecosystems that need to be developed. The capital is there from what we understand. The participation, of course, from various stakeholders within the financing cycle continues to remain. And, of course, the tangible outcomes on the ground is what we need. Political will has also been highlighted. That does certainly need to lead us to the forefront, and understanding the levels of ongoing collaboration that need to be highlighted, not only by different financiers, participation with key players, NOCs and IOCs, but also at a regional level. And ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we do conclude this particular panel discussion. I'm hoping that many of us have walked away just with an heightened level of understanding as to how it is that we do need to engage with providers of capital in understanding that the money is there. How we access it, how we do so sustainably, and how we ensure that we mitigate against any risk are the key priorities that we do need to bear in mind going forward. So, as we continue to journey towards production, I am told that there is some breaking news, but this would be good news for many of you as participants who are here. A text has actually just come through that Rhino Resources has actually announced that they have made a discovery of hydrocarbons at the Capricornus 1X well. So, in case you didn't know, more than anything, it shows us that we certainly need to continue not only exploring, but building up and beefing up to that level of production and ensuring that that does progress as well to a greater ecosystem and environment that can be developed for energy as a hub for Namibia as a region. Ladies and gentlemen, please give my panelists a round of applause for giving us their industry insight, their feedback, and their conversation.